Welcome to the Lorecast, where we look into the lore and the stories by which we live. I'm Dr. Craig Chalquist, and you can find us at chalquist.com/podcast and at a number of other online venues. When I was a kid, sometimes my friends would run up to me when they were upset with their parents or their families, and they would say, I think that I was actually secretly adopted. I don't think these people are related to me at all. These parents, I can't possibly imagine that they're my real parents. My real parents must be somewhere else. And then when they had calmed down a little bit and were more serious, they would ask me, isn't it cool that that's actually the case with you? And I would say, yeah. That can be a very handy defense to be able to tell yourself that as an adoptee. But then fast forward to my 20s when I met my birth families, most of the people in them, and I concluded that, they're pretty much in many ways like my adoptive family. So much for that fantasy. It's interesting being adopted, but in this podcast, while I'm going to talk about some of my experiences being adopted, I want to do it from the standpoint of adoption being a kind of microcosm or dramatization of basic issues that I think we all face, issues about identity and relationship and belonging. And I think that because we all do face these issues, one of the most valuable experiences in growing up adopted and finding out more about your roots is that you learn to take all of this less literally. So hopefully that'll be clearer by the end of this podcast. So to start with, I always have known I was adopted. My parents told me really early, and I recommend that parents do that. And for the most part, growing up adopted is the same as growing up any other way, but there are certain events that happen that cast a light on your different status. So for instance, in school doing the family tree exercise, right? So, and not knowing your family tree. In the days that I was adopted, closed adoption was still legal in the States, meaning your records were sealed and the identity of your birth family is kept secret. And this was done because of the intolerant idea that there's such a thing as illegitimate children, in other words, children born out of wedlock, which was a relic of Christian religious intolerance. And so there were whole generations of kids who were considered illegitimate. There's no such thing as an illegitimate child. They're all legitimate. And so because of adoptee activism, those laws were overthrown. Even though they were, however, to this day, I still can't see my original birth certificate. Even though I know my birth families, I've done a lot of research on all this, met people and all the rest of it. Still can't get a hold of it. It's strange. Other experiences that throw light on your being adopted. I remember being in a class when I was a kid. I'm thinking it must have been junior high, middle school. And we had a substitute teacher walk in, and he looked a lot like me. And the people who were friends in my class all knew I was adopted. So as one person, they all turned and looked at me like, whoa. And when that happens, or you're out in public somewhere, and it makes you wonder, is this person related to me directly? Am I looking at a family member and maybe I don't even know it? So that's kind of weird. And because of experiences like that, I always knew I was going to search. I always knew I was going to find my birth families to answer some questions. Not to give me a substitute family or anything like that. I just wanted to know where I came from, who I look like, where I get my interests. And speaking of interests, this can answer a lot of questions, this sort of search, because here I am growing up in a family where there's no real interest in classical music. My family likes music, but I just loved classical, Western classical from the moment I heard it. My interest in psychology At one time, my birth mother was in training to become a psychiatric social worker. My maternal grandfather had an ed psych degree. I mean, there's things that when you meet your birth families, the interest becomes obvious. When my grandfather died, I saw a letter from my birth mother, who I never met, and basically saying, I don't care about inheritance, I just want his Beethoven records. So, as I'll mention later, there were some odd twists in my particular adoption, pretty atypical twists, but more on that later. Now, one of the things I've really loved to do, and I've been thinking lately I want to keep doing it, haven't done it in a while, is I would meet informally with parents who are waiting to adopt and just answer whatever questions they had about the whole experience. I am not an expert on adoption law, adoption practice, or any of the mechanicals connected with any of this, the logistics, although, of course, I know something about it. But I can speak from experience in terms of being adopted and the complexities of meeting your birth families. And so that was a lot of fun. And I really admire that group of people, parents waiting to adopt. What I always found is parents to be who they were so anxious about getting it right. They were so excited to get the news about when their kids would arrive, and they were just lovely to talk to. I really enjoyed it and missed doing it. But one of the questions they would ask me, I touched on it earlier, is the one about when do we tell our child? And so social workers and psychologists often say when they're ready to ask you the question, and I think that's right. In my case, there was no feeling of trauma that I remember. I just grew up knowing. Now, I've met other adoptees who were told as adults or they found out by accident, and I always thought, wow. I mean, that that could be traumatic. You spend your whole life thinking that one person's your parent when they're actually your adoptive parent. So of course they're your parent, but I mean this puts a whole different level to it, and it makes you wonder what else you were told that wasn't true. So I absolutely don't recommend doing that kind of thing to a child or an adult. Tell them early, and don't tell them your adoptive child. Don't tell them lies about, well, we went to this big room with lots of babies in it and we picked out you, right? That's a great way to give a kid survival guilt. So don't do that. I mean, I've never understood why adopting parents do that. Mine did it a little bit at first, and then I questioned them further, and then I got more honest answers. But I don't know, maybe the intention is to spruce up the experience somehow or make it cool or whatever, but don't do that. Just tell them the truth and do it in terms that they can understand at whatever age they ask you. Another question that comes up is, especially nowadays in this era of open adoption, if my child wants to search for their roots, does it mean I'm doing something wrong as a parent? No, it probably means you're doing something right. It's natural to be curious. I was really surprised when I was doing my master's work, and my thesis had to do with the psychological issues that adoptees face. And I came across some numbers. I don't know if they're true anymore, but it was something like only 10% of us ever search for our birth parents' identities, birth families' identities, and I always thought that was really strange. I always wanted to know. So if you have a secure attachment, then great. Support your child in learning more about their roots. They'll find out something fascinating. I certainly did. Doesn't mean you're a bad parent or they want a different family. And, occasionally there are adoptees who are traumatized who do have that fantasy. I want to find my fabulous, noble parents and all this. And then they learn the truth, and it becomes a learning experience for them. Oftentimes they appreciate their adoptive family even more. Now, before doing this podcast, I did a little search on the internet. I was just curious about what's being talked about these days in terms of myths about adoption. And I came across an article by Tina Donvito, a pretty recent one actually. And it's called 16 Myths About Adoption You Need to Stop Believing. And I like this article. I want to use it to spring off for a couple of points about all this. It's in Reader's Digest, and The writer's last name is Donvito. So her first item is something I intended to talk about, which is myth. Adoptive parents aren't the child's real parents. I don't know how many times I've been asked, do you know who your real parents are? I have never been able to understand why somebody would ask a question like this. It's like asking, do you know you have a chin? I mean, it makes no sense to me. And I suspect the person asking has some family issues they need to look at. Every adoptee that I know realizes full well that the people who raise us are our parents. End of discussion. And, our birth parents, our biological parents, sometimes people call them that, they supply, the biological and genetic material, but the people who raise us are our parents. Why would anyone question that? Maybe I'm not supposed to understand. Her next item is myth: children who are adopted won't fit into the family. Actually, that does happen. It happened in some ways in my case. So, some of my relatives on my dad's side of the family always treated me differently. And there was always a lot of distance there. So it does happen, but I don't think it happens that often. It's not something I would worry about if I was a parent adopting a child. And then there's various myths, I'll condense them a bit, about how birth mothers, quote, give up their children, which is wrong. They don't give us up because they don't want us or because they're addicts or what have you. So here again, my experience is a little bit different from the norm in the sense that usually what happens is a birth mother or birth parents decide that they're in a tough situation. They can't raise children right now. They're fully aware of that. And they make a hard decision that's a good decision, that my child should be raised by parents who are more available. And they make that happen, which good for them, right? So that's similar to my situation. The twist in my situation that I mentioned earlier is that there was a battle between my birth mother being very clear, I want to give this child up for adoption, and my birth father and my birth mother's family and other people saying, you need to keep the child and raise it. So my mother solved this, if that's the right word, by arranging the adoption secretly and telling everybody that I had died at birth in the hospital. Wow. I was in my 20s when I found this out as part of my own search for my roots. And the first thing I did was go to my therapist. You can imagine the stuff that a revelation like that would bring up, that really core issues of identity and things like that. I learned later that my mother was actually a highly inventive person. Probably a big part of her life was of her own imaginative devising. Let's be polite and put it that way. So people were surprised, of course, and I had some fun with the Mark Twain dictum. The people in my birth families love to read like I do, and so I said reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated. But yeah, it was quite a bit of news, and it took a while for everyone to adapt to it. So, but that's atypical. So another concern that's mentioned in the article is that adoptive parents should be concerned that the birth parents want the child back. This has been hugely and falsely exaggerated by Hollywood and by the occasional situation where that does happen. But when you adopt, the birth parents sign off and they waive all legal rights permanently. So that's not something I would be worried about. The article includes something that's not always addressed that I really appreciate being in there. Myth: open adoption is confusing for the child. No. What's confusing is when there's all these family secrets that nobody's talking about. That is really confusing. Not knowing your roots is confusing. Not knowing who you look like is confusing. Not knowing why you have interests and passions that your family doesn't share is confusing. So open adoption, it adds another layer of complexity to things, but it can be navigated, especially with adoptive children who know perfectly well who's raising them. So there's no reason it has to be confusing. So I won't go through the rest of what the article already covers, but just to mention the writer's name again, Tina Donvito and Reader's Digest article called 16 Myths About Adoption You Need to Stop Believing. So I recommend it. Now, I should mention, as a former family therapist who was trained to look for intergenerational patterns, in birth families, these can sometimes take really interesting shapes. And there's a term I've been using, archetypal family dynamics is part of it, where you look at patterns and images and themes that roll down through the generations, both in your adoptive and your birth families. So, to give you an example of this, when I was getting to know my birth father a bit, one of the questions he asked me was, tell me the kinds of trouble that you got in when you were a boy. And so I did. And I mentioned to him that one of the things that I liked to do as a boy was either blow stuff up or set things on fire. And um, fortunately, I never got into an enormous amount of trouble. I did get into some trouble with that. And when I told him that, he laughed and he said, "Yeah, well, it kind of runs in the family." And he said, part of what I did in the Marine Corps is they taught me how to burn stuff up and blow stuff up, like professionally, you know. And he said, but it goes way back in our family. In fact, some of our ancestors burned Rome to the ground. And so there's this there's this theme on my birth father's side of the family of fire and the complexities of that. You know, whether it's setting things on fire or the passions, the fiery passions, and learning to manage those. Or there's a phrase I used to use in men's groups when I was teaching violent men to be peaceful, and I would talk about hold your fire, learn to hold your fire. And so it was interesting to me that I had kind of inherited that, even though I didn't grow up with my birth father. And likewise, there's a water theme that pops up a lot in my maternal birth family. For instance, they all have been out on the water a lot. My birth mother lived on boats. Um, my grandfather was buried at sea, things like that. Sailors all through the family. One of the family names is a Scottish name, Murdoch, which means sea warrior. So when my birth parents got together, they were married for a while and then split up. And that was a marriage, if you look at it through an archetypal or a symbolic eye, of fire and water. So no wonder it didn't work. Probably one of the most important things I learned from the whole experience of searching, in addition to being adopted, is that there are so many ways in which we identify with our roots. My country, my family, my blood relations, and things like that. And when you're adopted and learning about birth families, you're in a position to be able to say that while some of those things matter, they're not to be taken that literally. That your identity, in other words, is much more than where you come from. And so these themes that run down the generations in my birth and adoptive families, what really matters is my response to them. How will I hold them? How will I respond to them? What creative use can I make of what I was given? And in the long run, that's a lot more important than where I came from or some of these dynamics that went into my conception and birth and upbringing. We're more than family dynamics, we're more than socioeconomics, blood relations, genetics, and all the rest of it. And no, we can't just decide to be anything we want. But in the end, there's a creative set of choices we all have to make about who we are, where we come from, who our kindred are, and the course we decide to set for our own lives and how that affects the people we care about. Thank you.